And yep, hopefully it all makes sense, and we'll just start talking about stuff. So the first thing I just wanted to talk about is just a few little like kind of disclaimer things, and the first thing is the difference between calls and comms. Um, Comms are basically, I mean, well, so these two terms are kind of misused, I guess, or like interchangeably used, even though there's a specific definition for each of them. And I'll do the same thing as well. Literally everybody does this, but comms are, hopefully it might be, somewhat intuitive, but comms are basically, the information given out by everyone on the team, including the main caller. So this, includes like damage such as like demo hit 100 or something like that, or, they're pushing IT, something like that. Um, Calls, on the other hand, are like the actual decisions and the gameplay, like plans you're gonna have, and that's just something that not that many people are gonna call. Um, so it's only gonna be a couple of main callers at most. Generally, you're only gonna want like one or two main callers. However, there are nuances, and there are like specific situations where some people will call some parts of a plan, like after your main caller already calls like the overall goal of the plan. Um, Holy shit! I just realized I wasn't recording my mic. Okay, well hopefully that's not bad. But yeah. So the next thing I just wanted to talk about is decision making. So decision making is all about the different types of advantages, and essentially, in order to make a decision, you need to understand the advantages, and in order to have some like in order to make a main call for your team as a main caller. If you don't, if you need to understand the advantages, because otherwise you'll make a bad call and put your team in a bad position. um so the main types of advantages, and this goes in descending order of importance. So the most important thing is going to be first, and the least important thing is going to be last. The most important advantage is player advantage, then it's Uber advantage, then health advantage, class advantage, and positioning advantage. And we'll talk about all these in detail as well. But some of the main things to know is, while these are like that order was the most least important, these really, the how important advantages is not just by that order. It really does, the advantages scale in importance as the advantages become larger and larger. So for example, you know, even if like for example, it's better to have, you know, I mean, for example, having 100% Uber ad is better than, if you're like, even if the other team has a one player advantage on you, then so like a 5v6, if you have 100% Uber ad, that's generally still better for you. Um, you know, so obviously, some of these situations can be, there's a lot of nuances. So, um, you know, I guess I'll just start talking about some of these, all these different advantages, and we'll just go in the order of the list I mentioned. So the first advantage is player advantage, right? Now this is obvious, should be obvious, but if you have more people than the other team, and you would take a team fight, you should win that most of the time because you just have more players, right? So, for example, taking a 6v5, a 5v4, a 4v3, 4v2, something like that. Generally, since you have more players, you would win, right? And so that's why, generally you want to avoid taking a fight when you're at a disadvantage like that, where when you have a player disadvantage. However, it is important to note that, holding is, when you're holding a point, even if you like, or how do I say this? So, like the reasons why, even like sacking a player, which puts you at a player disadvantage, why you might think, even though it might seem as if like it's just awful, it's not as bad as you think, just because the fact that um, even if you have a one person player advantage, it doesn't necessarily mean it's super easy to push, because you have to be the aggressors, you have to take the extra damage from the spam, you have to fight for high ground, it's kind of like when you push, you become the offense and the other team becomes the defense. So while player advantage is good, it's not 100% of the time. Like, for example, when you do a single person like sack, like on an even Uber situation, it's generally not a great idea for the other team to try to push off of it, even though they have a single player ad, because, it's very hard to push out because they're on offense and you're on defense. And I can go into more details about that, but hopefully you understand, like, in attack defense, there's longer spawn times for the defense because defending is just easier. Um, we'll next just talk about Uber advantage, right? So Uber is always just, Uber is, invincibility, obviously, and it takes 40 seconds to build your Uber at the max building rate, which means, you know, you can kind of split it up into either like 25% Uber chunks of 10 seconds or 20% Uber chunks of 8 seconds each. And so, for example, even if you have 20% Uber ad, that can go very quickly just like that, because even if you have 20% Uber ad, that means even if you pop right then, once your Uber's over, the other team probably has Uber. So it's important to realize, that's not as big an advantage as you think it is. And we'll talk about how to, like what things you should do to work off your advantages as well later. But, that's how Uber works, obviously. And having Uber is better because, if you have Uber and the other team doesn't, as long as the other team doesn't have a bunch of other advantages on you, it's it's pretty good for you if you have Uber and they don't. Next thing we're talking about is health advantage. Obviously, if you have low health, and the other team doesn't, if you try to take a team fight, even if like there's like, for example, let's say there's no Ubers involved and it's a 6-on-6, if your team is super low and you try to take a fight with the other team, the other team's probably going to win because they're healthier than you, whether that's, like overheals or just health in general. If everybody on your team is fucking 20 HP and everybody on the other team is full HP, it's not going to be very good for you because, the other team is just healthier. Hopefully that should be just intuitive. And the other two advantages are class advantage. So in terms of class advantage, generally it all depends. Class advantage is kind of just on it's kind of like an offset of a player advantage, because different classes do different things and they have different values. You can kind of, if the other team is down a specific class or pair of classes, depending. So, for example, if the other team is down a medic, or the other team is down a demo, or the other team is down both soldiers or both scouts, things like that can be exploited, because that's an advantage for you because the other team doesn't have as much like a wholesome team, maybe not wholesome team unity, but as much of a balanced team fighting ability, because there are weaknesses introduced when you're down 2 soldiers, or you're down 2 scouts, or you're down your demo, or you're down your med. So that's an advantage, but it's slightly less, it's less important than the other ones. Last advantage is just positioning advantage. So obviously for scouts and soldiers, high ground is just like the best thing ever. And if you're not on high ground and the other team is, you're just in a worse position, which is why if the other team is trying to take a fight, say from from Al Qaeda, it's not always the easiest thing, just because everybody just has high ground, and you have to challenge them on the high ground. So this is especially like important, like for example on mid on process, where if you try to push through this choke when it's just like 6 on 6, even if the health is all even and everything like that, the other team is going to have this ground. They're going to be able to, their soldiers are going to spam out the choke. If your soldiers try to bomb through the choke, your scouts are going to shoot them out of the air. Your demo is going to lock out the choke with, traps and spam pipes, and it's going to be really bad. So, yeah, go ahead. That's interesting. Sorry about that.
Do you want me to record still, M17, or no?
Yeah, you can. I mean, I'm recording as well, but if you're here willing to record, that's awesome. Yeah, whatever.
I won't record then.
Okay. Um, so now that we just talked about the other advantages, uh, when you're trying to figure out like making a decision or what as a main caller, when you're trying to figure out what main call you're going to make, it's all about those advantages, right? And so in order to make that decision, you first have to figure out what advantages you and your team have over the enemy team, right? Okay, so generally the first advantages you should be basically all the time, the first advantages you should always be thinking about first are player advantage and Uber advantage, right? Those are the two most important, and now of course, as you get more comfortable with thinking about those two advantages, you can start working the other three more. But you know, the player and Uber advantage are the most important thing, and generally, you need to figure out what those are. And so, you know, in order to figure out what the advantages are, you have to actually get the information. Uh, so, for example, to get the player ad, all you have to do is either press tab and you'll see, who's alive on your team and who's dead. Or if you look at let's see if I can do this, the GUI at the top of your screen, if you have 6 players on their team and, they have, for example, if they have 2 gray skulls next to, under their names, that means they're 2 players down, which means, you have a 2-player ad on them. That should be pretty obvious. That's basically what you do. Of course, there is a nuance to this because remember that when their players respawn, their players, like, even though you killed them, they're going to respawn eventually. So this means that the longer ago you killed them, the less time it's going to take for them to be like the less time it's going to take for them to be back in the fight. So generally, once a player respawns, unless that player is respawning and they're on their own last, you generally want to give it a few seconds, anywhere from like say 5 to 10 seconds, for them to roll out and then be back with their team fighting. So obviously different maps will have different respawn times as well, but adding in the rollout time, which was those 5 to 10 seconds I talked about earlier. Just adding that on to whatever respawn timer they have. That's generally how much time you have to work off of a player ad, and obviously it should be pretty obvious how you figure out what a player ad is. Um, in terms of Uber ad, to figure out what that Uber ad is, you literally ask in your team comms, you ask your team, say, what are Ubers? Just like that, those 3 words. Ideally, your med's going to be tracking this. And then when you ask what are Ubers, your med should just say, we have 40 ad, we're 20 dis ad, something like that. So that once you get that information, you can make the call accordingly. We'll talk about making, like, what calls you should, like some examples of what calls you should make later, but ideally your med should be tracking the Uber. Um, obviously meds aren't, perfect. We're all humans, so sometimes there's going to be mistakes. Generally, it's better to err on the side of caution. So, for example, um, you know, if you think, if your med says, I think we're maybe 40 ad, I'm not 100% sure, you generally probably want to err on the side of, oh, it's even Ubers, because we don't want to like put us in a situation where we think we have an Uber ad when we don't. So generally, you want to err on the side of caution. Also, sometimes, if your med isn't that confident, which is generally how you judge, uh, how if your med is correct about the Uber advantage. So, for example, if your med is extremely confident, saying like, we have 40 Uber ad, then you basically just want to believe that. You generally just want to lean towards trusting your med. But if your med really isn't confident, or and somebody else is confident on your team that they know the Uber ad, you can trust them when you ask what are Ubers in your comms. Or, for example, I mean, there's the rare cases of like three of your teammates all saying, no, their med died, we have 40 ad or something like that. And then, even if your med is confident, yeah, maybe you would trust those three players. But generally, try to
There's
lean
also the
towards
option of
how
learning to track
confident your med
Ubers
is.
yourself.
Yeah, I was gonna say everyone should learn at least like some general tips of tracking Uber. There's easy ways to do it, right? Medics typically do it based off of either intuition, like a mixture of intuition and just counting the time. But there's like things like, oh, we killed their med in our Uber, we're gonna have 30 ad. We killed their medic on mid, our medic lived, we have pretty much full ad. It's basic things like that you can just learn that can happen on any map and in a majority of situations, and so you can just use those as ways to track Uber yourself. It's not very precise, but it's good in case anybody loses track, and it gives you a good like general time frame of what Ubers are, and your medic can be like, oh, we actually have 40 yet because they weren't beaming or whatever.
Yeah,
So it's good to be able to count Ubers no matter what class you are. But it is helpful to, it is the medic's job to do that. So if you lose track, it's not a big deal, but it's always a good idea to be able to learn how to track them as well.
of course. And that's generally what, your other teammates are going to do. But it's important to remember that, your team, while they could be confident, one of your meds like specific jobs is to track Uber. So, if it's one player on your team confident versus your med on your team being confident, you should generally just trust your med because they're supposed to be the one tracking that. But, there are obviously situations where if you're not sure, you can err on the side of caution, just like we said. So, for example, if you killed their med on mid, and and your med lived, then you'll have a full Uber ad, and so but I mean, while that's not exactly a full Uber ad, like 100%, you can generally say, okay, it's probably at least 60, if not like 80, it should be. So we should be okay to just take our time, but we want to get use our Uber advantage eventually, right? The next advantage is health advantage. Obviously, on the GUI, you can't actually, see the other team's health. The only way you can know the other team's health is, you know, based on calls that your teammates have given and how much damage you've done. So, for example, if you've done like 200 to their soldier, that means he's, you know, definitely under 100 because of any overheals, and so he's probably pretty low there. Um, so generally, if you hear like your demo is like piping a bunch of players, what that means is like they're probably pretty low. However, since you don't know exactly what their health is, generally you should be careful when trying to assume how much health they have, and just remember that generally the longer it's been since you've done damage, the more likely it is that they're going to be, gotten healthy. So, for example, if you did like a crap ton of damage, but it was like 30 seconds ago, you should probably assume that they're all healed up by now. Whereas, if you did a decent amount of damage, but it was like 2 seconds ago, there's no way they're all healed up in 2 seconds. So, yeah. In terms of your team's health, though, it's much simpler. You literally just look at the team health on your GUI. If everybody's overhealed, it'll look nice. But, if you have a few players who are in red like this, generally you just want to heal up first before doing anything. if your team is ever like really low, it's generally just a good idea to just take a few seconds to heal up before you do anything. And so if anybody on the team calls this or sees this, include like even if it's not your main caller, just saying just telling your team heal up first or we need to heal up, something like that is really important because even if you guys think you have some sort of advantage, if you all try to go in with 40 health, that is not going to be good. And so, even if you have like a 2-player advantage and like a small Uber advantage, if all of you are 40 health and the other team is like all full health, that's just asking for a disaster. Yeah, go ahead.
So I will say, it is again typically your medic's job to pay attention to your team's health, and it's good to like bring up the thing, but that is a lot less of a like 100% their job. Like Uber's should be 100% your medic's job, but um, looking at your player's health is definitely something that's really important on a main caller because if you are pocket scout, you typically are going to be the healthiest player on your team 99% of the time. So it's easy for you to get really overconfident and be like, "Oh, I'm really healthy here. My medic is on me. I'm just going to assume that I can commit here." But then you look up top and your demo is 50 HP. He can't even sticky jump. Your soldier needs an arrow. The other one is getting a pack, and your flank scout is capping the point. It's just you and your medic, right? Those are situations that you do need to recognize. Okay, my team is unhealthy. If I make a call here, it's going to get a majority of us killed, or it's not going to be committed on. So um, it is really important for those transitional periods, right? So if you are trying to chase a kill and you want players with you, or you're trying to chase to get frags because you have a medic, they don't, you should be like, okay, well, my demo has 150, my pocket soldier has about 120. I should be able to chase here confidently, and we should be able to get these frags, right? Like that's decent enough health. But if you're, again, like your demo is like 50 HP, it's unreasonable to be like, why didn't you commit there? Because he's like, well, I couldn't even sticky jump. So the recognizing your team's health is a really important part of uh, being a main caller. And I would honestly recommend getting a HUD that has your player's health like very very visible on the top of your screen. Um, it's really nice to be able to just look up and see, oh, these guys are all in the red and I'm in the green. We should probably wait, right? It's
Go ahead.
it's really helpful.
Yeah,
Okay.
so the thing is, like, you can ask your team if, are we healthy? But I actually wouldn't really recommend that, and I could get into more detail exactly, like, saying that, but there's a better call you should be asking. You should be saying, can we fight or can we commit? But I can go into more detail about that later. The point is, like he was saying, generally he was saying the pocket scout, but in reality, it's generally just whoever's the main caller is going to have the most HP on the team and is going to be having the med beam with them. So you as a main caller should be trying to actually actively look for your team's health. But that being said, like I was saying, if you hear a teammate call, we need to get healthy, you generally just like 99% of the time, you just want to listen to that teammate and you just want to look and see like, oh hey, my team's not healthy. We can't fight. I have to wait for my med to heal my players before we can do anything. However, obviously, if you're 6 alive but you're all like 80 HP or whatever, and it's just their medic, that's a different story. There you probably still do want to chase, even though you guys are only like half HP. You know.
Yeah, it's all
Um.
really situational.
Yeah.
Um, if for example, like you said, your entire team's alive and it's just their medic, nobody else to fight you really. You could easily commit on that. If, for example, it's a fully tanked pocket scout and the rest of your team is 40 HP, but majority it's like 5v2, you definitely don't want to chase that because the scout is just going to kill all of you. It's good. Like you need to be able to just recognize situations, look at who's alive, what they're capable of, and how much health they have. Um, like M17 was saying, you just got to pay attention to those advantages.
Yep. So the next advantage, how to determine, is the class advantage. Again, you're just going to use this GUI at the top. Whenever one of their players is dead, like so, for example, if you kill their demo, you'll see that their demo will be crossed out on their team, right? So obviously that means their demo is dead, and that is just how you would figure that out. Of course, just like for classes, you need to keep track of the respawn times and whatnot. And so generally, the longer ago you killed that player, the less amount of time it's going to take them to rejoin the fight. But, you know, it should be pretty easy to just tell just by looking at the top, which classes you have, which classes the other team has, and then you can make the decision of what to work off, what to do based on that. The last one is positioning. In general, for figuring out the positioning, the first thing you can do is obviously just look at your teammates really quickly and see where they are, or just see if they're like, they have high ground or they have the chokes locked out or whatnot. However, sometimes you might be respawning or rolling out and you're running to the fight, or it might be chaotic, so you were like trying to pick a guy in IT and you don't know if your team is like in a good position to fight, second, or we just have to, run back out to mid or something like that. So, in that situation, you would want to ask your team saying, like, do we have space on second, or can we fight second here, or something like that, where, asking your team that and then, them telling you if they have the positioning to, fight second, like if they're all just like, clumped up in this choke, and their demo and both their soldiers are locking this out. You know, you know, even if you're like an IT, you can't really. It's not a great idea to. Your team won't be able to fight because they don't have the positioning because they have three explosive classes locking them out. So, besides just looking at where your team is, you want to ask them like, do we have space on mid, or do we have space to fight second, or can we fight second, right? Um, in terms of the other team, obviously you can't see through walls or anything like that. And the only really information you can get about the enemy team's location is based off your team's calls and what you see. So, um, besides that, generally it's kind of like, I would say it's maybe like a little bit more in terms of how extreme you have to err on the side of caution in terms of compared to like the health advantage. But generally, if it's been a few seconds and you haven't seen the other team for a few seconds, like 5, maybe 10 seconds, you should just assume they've taken the positioning. So, for example, if like after 5 to 10 seconds, you haven't been in mid and then you want to pressure mid and you don't know if they have positioning, if it's been like 10 seconds, you should probably assume that their demo is going to have, sticks and choke. They're going to have soldiers and like a scout on high ground ready to fight you. However, this doesn't mean that you can't like even get more accurate information. For example, if you just peek the choke and then you suddenly see they're all like, I don't know, clumped up on the point over here, that suddenly tells you that they don't have, the positioning. But generally, if you can't peek, or, you're not sure, it's generally better to err on the side of caution haven't if you haven't seen them for like 10 seconds and they've had a point, right? Um Now, in terms of all the advantages, one of the most important things is to remember to listen to the rest of your teammates' comms. If they say something, I mean, you basically just have to, believe that that's where it was, like that's true. Obviously, players' positionings can change and whatnot, but I mean, your teammates shouldn't be like they're not going to be lying to you. They're not going to purposefully give you wrong information. So remember to listen to your team's, comms, because you can't be in all 6 places at once. You're not going to get every single piece of information that your roamer has. So it's important to remember to, actually listen to, what your other players are like, the information the other players are giving you, so you can, figure out the advantages and then so you can make a better decision on that. Right.
I'd also say, just to add to that, um, if you're a lot of flanks when you're first starting out and newcomer are very quiet. A lot of flank players tend to be very silent people and silent fraggers. Um, if they aren't giving you the information you need to be like, yo, you need to calm more because I don't know what's happening on your side. You guys need to calm more. Can you tell me what you're doing? Can you tell me where they are? Can you tell me if you guys are fighting anything or anything like that? Because that information is important for you and the rest of your team. Um, because if they win a fight on the flank or if they completely lose a fight on the flank, that affects what you're able to do in the next 20 seconds. And so if they're not communicating what they're doing, then it can cause a lot of either issues or it can lose you out on a lot of advantages that you could have had if they would have just said something. So if they're really silent, you just need to be like, "Hey, could you like talk, please?" That would be really helpful. So,
So yeah, so it's definitely good to, ask your teammates to do that, and we'll talk about more about how to get more coordination from your, or like how to get, more from your teammates a bit, and how to, be nice about it as well. But, um, yeah, don't be afraid to ask some people to give out some more information or specific information. Um, but even if they're not giving out that information, feel free to specifically ask like where are they, or what do you see flank, or what's going on flank or something, or are they pushing somewhere. We'll go over more about what to call specifically later, but feeling if you're not getting the information you need, then you specifically like ask questions, or like ask them to give you that information, and that's how you actually get the information, because obviously you can't see from their screen, right? um One of the last things to note on that point is that everyone makes mistakes, including you. So if your teammates give you some bad information, it happens. So don't get too mad at them about it, because everyone makes mistakes. We're all human. So just assume it's going to happen at one point, and just do your best to work off the information you're given. Um, in general, when you're asking your teammates questions, uh, try to keep it to a few words. Some of the, try to say some of the things I've said before that are also in the document, but, try to keep it to a few words. Ask specifically what you want, and, don't try to make it just drawn out. Try to avoid that. Just, ask, do we have this? Like, what's your health? Things like that. Yeah, you just got to keep them to as few words as possible, and obviously that just takes time and practice. But if you say some of the things, and also just as you main call more, you'll get more comfortable with that. Um, okay. Let's see. Um, does anybody have any questions about that actually before I keep going? Okay. Then we'll just continue, and we'll talk about making a plan. So just like I said before, in order to like figure out what your team is going to do, first you need to figure out the advantages. So that was what we just talked about. But once you've determined the advantages, you have to make a call that your whole team can follow, right? So in general, you want to like we were saying, you want to think about the impact that each advantage has. So for example, having a 5-player ad means you can you know, you should be able to just take a point for free or anything like that, because, if their one player challenges your team, they just die because they're in a 1v6 team fight, right? And so, um, you should generally be thinking about what all these advantages do. More players means, you know, more people to shoot at the enemy team, more targets for them to focus on. It means an easier time for your team to focus fire the enemy team. So that's why, it's better for you. That's why it's an advantage for you. Uber is obviously 8 seconds of invincibility that your med can, flash over to their teammates as well. So, you don't want to, bring a bunch of your players into like, you know, their players in like a close position when they have Uber and they have like a soldier and a demo and a scout there, or like a soldier like right there, because If they Uber on you, then they're just gonna, kill all you right there if you're just all in a clump position. So, um, you know, hopefully that makes sense. Obviously what Uber is and what it does. Let's see. In terms of health, obviously, if you have lower health than the enemy team, it's harder for you to take a fight. It means you die quicker. You're gonna get more easily focused fired by the enemy team. Things will be more chaotic. Yeah. Um, in terms of class advantages, I'll actually talk about that in a second because there's, the different class advantages, give you different things that you can work off of. But obviously, positioning means, if you have positioning and the enemy team doesn't, then it's generally easier for you to win a team fight because, soldiers and scouts on high ground are very good. Yeah, that should make sense. In terms of the class advantages, I'll just go through, some of the four major ones I'd already listed. So, if there's no Ubers in play, obviously, if one team has a medic and the other team doesn't, like so for example, if you have a medic and the other team doesn't, remember that the other team can't take as long of these like drawn out fights where you guys are, taking your time, spamming stuff like that, taking it slower and overall just playing the fact that you guys have an overheal and you guys can constantly be rehealed pretty easily, whereas the other team doesn't. So this generally means that you don't want to just like all go into them ASAP when you have a medic because, and they don't because, that's what they would want. Because if you take a longer fight, which is what you want, you can continuously work off your heals, you do more damage, and even if you guys, assuming you guys do and take the same damage, your med can heal you up for some of that damage, so the damage they do is less impactful than your damage. If you have a demo and the enemy team doesn't, what that means is they're generally just gonna be able to lock you out of chokes more. They're going to be able to take longer range fights because the demo can obviously charge up stickies and shoot them a mile away. He can get players off this high ground. He can just take his time. It's kind of similar to the med, but remember that Demo is great in long range, and he also just has this great spam, and he has so much ammo he can work off of. So, generally, if you're going to fight, if your team has a demo and the other doesn't, you don't want to like super close the distance. You want to try to keep it at longer range so that you can use the fact that you have a demo and he can do more damage at long range than anybody else. I mean, except for the sniper, but yeah. So you'll want to, abuse the fact that you have a demo, play around the fact that you have a demo, and, let your demo go to work just doing damage. If the other team doesn't have soldiers, what that means is that they really can't, bomb, they can't counter jump, they can't pressure the enemy demo as well, so they won't be able to pressure your demo. So, if the other team doesn't have soldiers, what that means is your demo has a lot more free reign to, do all this shit without having to worry about a soldier bombing and potentially, killing him or just making him, back up so he doesn't die. So, and besides that, when you get on high ground, if they don't have soldiers, they can't counter jump your guys on high ground. They also can't, get some of the nice instantaneous spam angles that the soldiers have. So, for example, if you land on this high ground, like the only person who can really shoot this guy off is the demo. Whereas normally a soldier has like a nice angle there. I'll show off in a second, but scouts obviously can't shoot that. But if you're a soldier, then all you have to do is shoot just like this. You can just shoot this, and then they're off this high ground, right? But if they don't have soldiers, then suddenly these angles become a lot harder for them to deal with because they can't do this, and they also just can't like counter jump when you guys rocket jump. So when they don't have soldiers, you want to abuse the fact that you have soldiers, and your soldiers can pressure their demo. So your soldier will do some sort of a bomb somehow to draw the eyes of their demo and make him less comfortable, and make him respect you more. So he can't just send a bunch of damage out to the enemy team. So something like this where you jump and maybe like fade away or something. And yeah, hopefully that makes sense. If the enemy team doesn't have scouts, um, obviously that means that they can't really deny soldier bombs at all. So your soldiers can get a lot more aggressive, right? Because, if a soldier, does this into two scouts, that's if they're like two scouts on these high grounds here, it's going to be, not great. The scouts are just going to shoot them out of the air. But, if there's no scouts alternatively and the soldier doesn't fuck up his rocket jump, but, if he does something like this, then suddenly that's a lot more powerful because there's not a scout there to shoot him out of the air. So he's like landing on high ground, doing a lot more damage. And so being able to collapse with your soldiers can be really powerful if they don't have scouts. Um, yeah, hopefully that makes sense. Does anybody have any questions about what the advantages really mean for, what you guys should be doing as a team overall? Uh, okay. I guess the next thing I'm going to talk about is just things you should say when you're making that plan. So, when you're making a plan, you don't want to, micro your teammates. You don't want to tell them exactly what to do. You want to generally just, say what your whole team is going to do, and then your teammates should all be figuring out what they should all know based off of that call what they're going to do, right? Now, when you're making this call, it's
I think that
generally
depends on the team. Especially at lower levels, I think some players do need microing because when you call something, they don't necessarily know what that means.
well. So here's the thing. So I mean, generally, while giving I'll go into more details about that, but if you're making a specific call, if you're giving them the information they need, they shouldn't really, have too much of an issue, except if it's, something specific that they wouldn't necessarily think about. Now, obviously, at lower levels, you're not going to be as comfortable knowing exactly what to do. So, in those kinds of situations, even though I still wouldn't micro, you could give maybe you could maybe do a quick explanation. Like, so for example, say, flank, wait a few seconds, and then come in and help focus kills, then point, something like that. But for example, if you're making a push, and you're making a call to your team, you want to give your team some important information. Um, so generally, in terms of that information, I like to I like to tell my team where the push will start, where the combo is going to be pushing from, where the push is generally going to end, and the if you can try to tell your team the main goal of the push. So for example, if we were on gully wash and we were using onto last, we might say something, and we had like an Uber advantage. We might say something like, "Let's Uber through river to kill the gun, and then end on top right." And that tells your team, we're starting Ubering through river. We're making sure we kill the gun, and ending on top right. Hopefully that makes sense. For example, if we were on Sunshine, we could say like, "Lead on demo, slow through cafe, try to milk and end on concrete," which that just tells when you have when you have Uber and the other team doesn't, and you're pushing on to second, that tells your everybody on your team, okay, who's going to be first in, what the ultimate goal is. Hopefully everybody should be able to work off that. But like I was saying, if sometimes your teammates don't understand, you can try to give that information. But in general, if your teammates don't understand, one thing they should be doing is probably trying to ask what they should be doing as like, a flank or something like that. Now, obviously, some players are too quiet, but or some players don't want to like take the initiative to say what they're going to do. So if you don't trust your team, even though I still don't recommend microing, you may want to, say an extra couple of quick words, like just, slow, like for example, if you are um pushing into second on Sunshine when you have an Uber ad, and you were saying like, "Lead on demo, slow through cafe, try to milk and end on concrete," you might say, "Flank clear valley slowly, wait for us on wait until we get to concrete, or wait until we're fighting concrete, you know, and then that would, you know, tell your flank the information, but you're still not saying, you know, push through this second, scout stand here, soldier stand here, or anything like that, because that is just gonna not only make people mad, but it's also just gonna waste too much time.
I think the only person that genuinely should really be microed is probably your medic. Just because even though they know the situation and they want to, they pretty much are just following whatever you do. So sometimes your medic might need microing, but in general, I think it's better practice to just ask, like, if a push goes wrong, just ask what happened on everybody's side. So you'd be like, okay, where did we come in? They'd be like, oh, we did this, and you'd be like, oh, okay, so next time don't do that, do this instead, and then that's how you learn.
Yeah,
Um,
so I will talk about that. There's definitely some things about that, like for example, you know, you don't want to overwhelm everybody, and don't want to do like everything all at the same time while you're playing. So I'll talk about that more a bit later. But in terms of what he was saying about the med there, um, well, you still don't definitely want to micro your med like micro. You know, as a main caller, or like I mean specifically as a combo scout like main caller, if you're, you know, for example, pushing into mid right here as a scout, right? You're going to clear the traps and you're going to look for soldier hiders. So, for example, if there's a soldier here, maybe a soldier here, right? And so, in that scenario, something you could say is like med bait choke, and then once you clear a specific trap, you can say, you know, no hiders, hug left to get in med. That would tell your med exactly where to get in, but you don't want to like tell them, okay, stay with me here, now wait and choke, now hug the left, and now like walk through this specific angle, hug this angle. You know, you just want to give them the information that they can work off of without, you know, telling them exactly where to stand at every second. Just telling them generally like to bait or something like that is better than telling them to sit at the entrance to choke and wait until I call. You know?
yeah, that's I think, yeah, that's normally like what I mean. I think microwing does just genuinely make people upset. So I would just,
Well,
yeah, just
yeah. So in terms of microing, there's like the problem is not only does it make some people upset, but if they do something slightly wrong, it might make you upset. It also, you know, is going to waste way too much time. You know, you can't just like it is impossible if you're telling every single player where they should stand, like at what single second, you know, you'll never have a successful push ever.
The
And
From my
yeah, go ahead.
experience, I played on well, I was scrimming with an IM team for a little bit as their medic, right? And the problem with being microed is that the player doesn't actually fully understand what's going on and what you're seeing, right? So they'll make calls for you, what for something for you to do, right? But then something happens on your screen and you're not able to fully follow up. And then they ask you what happened, right? And you said, "Well, I this happened and I had to do this." And I couldn't communicate to you in time, right? So I don't know. It's micromanaging can work, but it's it's hard, right?
Well, so part of the problem is when you're micromanaging, like you were saying, you know, you're also just the medic doesn't have the information you're giving them. So, for example, um, you know, something it would actually be better to say like no sticks on left choke med. So that tells your med that okay, like since there's no stickies on left, I can walk through the left, which is why I'm like on the left rather than having telling your med hug left here, because then your med is just like, okay, when do I stop hugging left, you know? Or like, and you know, do I, you know, your med is kind of just like, you know, your med doesn't have all the information you're giving, whereas, you know, if you're actually telling them there's no stickies on left, they know they should hug left until they get through the choke, and then they can stop hugging left because now they know that there's no stickies, you know, now they don't have to worry about the stickies on the right, and they can suddenly just be, you know, back to playing with the rest of the team and not having any issues like that. Of course. So yeah, that's something I'm actually gonna go into in a bit. I believe that's later in the document. Yeah, but I mean, yeah. So generally, you don't want to be, you know, having to go through every single detail of what this means and what that means, and so going through those things beforehand is good, and we'll talk about that in a bit. But yeah. Um. Okay. Um. I guess I'll talk about some other examples. So say if you're like holding and you're expecting, and you're at like an Uber disad and you're expecting them to push, you as a main caller could say something like, uh, or since your team would call it, or your med or whatever would call it, you have disad, you'd say, okay, let's lose one for the force and leave choke. That tells your combo that you're going to be leaving choke. One of your flank players is going to be going for that force, and everybody else should be just trying to spam, but then just trying to leave and keep themselves alive, right? So, giving your team the information while not telling them, exactly what to do all the time because it just takes too long is important. In terms of when you're making these plans as well, remember you don't want to use your advantages that you have for like just for a small thing. Generally, you want to take your one advantage and then you know get another advantage off of your advantage. So, for example, if you have an Uber advantage in a 6-on-6 and you use Uber, just taking a point without killing a single player, that's not great because while you took the point, now suddenly they have an Uber advantage and you just took a single point. Whereas, if you're maybe able to get like 2 picks and then take the point, that's a lot better because now you work that into, having a 2-player advantage, or maybe, you kill their demo and their soldier or something like that, right? So that means they have a lot less spam. So generally, you want to use one advantage to get another advantage, if you can. I mean, obviously, you're not always going to have, the best. You're not always going to have a perfect push or whatever. You're not going to, your decision or your plan isn't always going to work out perfectly, but that's generally the idea. In terms of advantages, it's also important to remember that the bigger the advantage, the more likely you should just like use it. So, for example, like we were saying with sacking earlier, 1-player advantage isn't that big, so you probably don't want to do something off it, especially at lower levels. But if they're down like 4 players, that is huge. So that's a huge advantage. You basically have to do something off that because that's just so good, right? And so, obviously that means like an 80 Uber advantage is better than a 20 Uber advantage, right? And you could keep going with this line of thought, but, hopefully that makes sense. Let's see. In terms of making plans, there's also a few other things to note, like, for example, figuring out some things that your team does and doesn't like to do. For example, if you're, how do I say this? If your soldiers don't like, sacking into, choke from second, just like onto the med or something like that, then maybe what you would feel more comfortable doing as a team is trying to go for specific picks instead. Like, for example, instead of telling them to sack for the med, if you see a demo over here, you can have your pocket jump behind him, juggle him up, and then while he sacks for this demo, your combo helps finish this guy off, right? And obviously, there's other things you can do of that sort, but making sure your team, figuring out what your team is good at and what your team likes to do is really important to making a decision. So you don't want to like force your team to do something they're never ever comfortable with. If your teammate specifically tells you, "I don't like doing this," if it's something where there's other things you can do and you probably should do, then it might just be better to do that so that your teammate, especially if it's something, where it's not like the one only thing you can do, being able to accommodate to what your teammates like is pretty important. And on like the opposite point, if you see that there's something that the other team is really bad at, for example, like if you're like if they're like down a player on last and they're really bad at like trying to, or like if it's 5-on-5 on last and they're really bad at like holding off pressure when you guys are just pressuring from 5, for example, then you should be abusing that because, the other team isn't really good at stopping you from abusing it. So that's a plan that you can probably work off again. Besides that, there's some advantages that you may want to try to work off of. And if it fails, that's okay. So for example, if you guys are trying to push into mid off of like a player advantage, and so you would say, and it's not like it's only like a single player advantage, or maybe it's like a 5-on-4 for your team. You could say something like, or maybe like a 5-on-5, but they're all somewhat low. You could say like, let's try to fight mid here, and then your team tries to take a fight, and then if you have to leave, you would tell your team specifically, okay, let's get out. Now, obviously, there are some times where you just can't do this, and a lot of this just comes down to practice, but that's something you can potentially try out, especially in scrims. But overall, it's definitely tough to practice everything here because there's lots to remember and think about. So the big things to do is to remember, always focus first on the player in the Uber ads and making sure your team is healthy. And then once you are generally feeling more comfortable with that, that's when you start adding in other advantages that your team can work on. And besides that, there are other times you can talk about what your team feels comfortable with. So for example, in scrims and matches, it's generally you won't have as much time to figure out what your team is comfortable with, but in between half times, when a round has just ended, when it's a stalemate, when, for example, I don't know, like during a map review or a demo review, or like when you're asking coaches, that's a great time to, figure out, what your team feels like more comfortable with, what your team is better at doing, or just, when you did something wrong based off an advantage, or, how good a decision was. Just figuring that out is easier when you're not like in the middle of a scrimmer match. So while it's just going to take practice, and I think later on we'll go over some more ways you can practice this, but yeah, but it'll take some time. So just try to focus on the Uber and player advantage, making sure your team is healthy, and then once you feel more confident with those, then you can start to build in, maybe trying to use a class advantage you have, or a health advantage, or position advantage. Anybody have any questions for now? Okay. I guess we'll just move on then to actually making calls. Generally, when you make a call, you want to make a call when the situation changes, which is like when the advantages change. So, for example, you don't want to make a call like if you've already made a call and then 2 seconds later, your soldiers through choke. You don't want to make a call as in okay, like you don't want to repeat the same call that you just said over and over again. But you also to that same token, you don't want to, wait a year to make a new call. So, for example, if if your soldier gets a force on the Uber, you should see if you can make a new call now because now the advantage has changed. You sacked the player, but your your soldier got the force or whatever. So now that you have an Uber ad, right, you should try to make a plan since the advantages have changed, right? When you're making these calls, there are some things that you shouldn't say. Obviously, remember, try to not ramble. Try to keep your words concise. If a lot of teammates don't understand, like if a lot of teammates are confused, you should try to recall that. But if it's generally if you have teammates not understanding what's going on, it's just important to rephrase what you said so that your teammates know what your call was, so that everybody can play together. Because Like the biggest thing is all working off the same goal. That's like the most important thing you can do. And that's the reason why you have a main caller, because if you guys are all doing different things, it's going to be awful. And you're just going to play worse rather than if you are all doing the same, if you all have the same goal, right? Excuse me. Like we said, when you're making a call, you want to include the goal along with the starting location of what's happening in the ending location. And like we said, you don't want to micro the players. However, if there's something specific that you want your teammates to do that they might not normally do, or that is like special, for example, oh hey, I want this time when we're pushing through choke, I want my flank scout to watch IT only, and I want my roamer to do a fake bomb, right, or something like that, where they, maybe do something like this, where they do a bomb here and then fade away, something like here. Yes, but if I want my roamer to do a fake bomb, that's where you would tell roamer, can you fade away back to their sewer from choke? Telling your players specifically what they want to do, but you're not gonna tell every single player what you want to do, and that like what they're supposed to do in that situation, because the other players should know based off your call of like, okay, we're gonna pressure through choke here trying to get a pick, or we're gonna slowly walk through choke trying to milk med bait, something like that. But you don't want to tell every single player, like you don't want to tell your demo, okay, walk here, sticky this thing. You don't want to tell your pocket soldier, land on this, reload, then do another rocket jump here and land on this, something like that, right? You don't want to tell them every single location thing they're supposed to do. But, telling people that what they can't really like infer from your call, then you should tell them that. In general, it may seem tough to make sure you're not coming off as an asshole, or like being rude or whatever. So there's a few things to note about that. First, you should remember that while you are on a team, you need to make a main call, and everybody needs to follow the same thing and all do the same thing. So, it's okay to speak, assertively and be confident in what you're saying. Being confident is really important, even if your teammates give you other information, like maybe if you need to change it, you still have to be confident in what you're saying. You say it like with strength. You don't want to say like, okay, maybe we should do this. You say, do this, let's do X, whatever. Some things generally you want to do is, try to, I mean, this is maybe a little like weird to say, but it's probably a good idea to say like, use pronouns like saying like, let's do X. If you let's do X, like where you're using like the word us, like, so you're including, even though you're saying something, you're saying it as in we as a team are going to do this, or like we can do this here, or let's do this, something like that is better than saying do this, do that, do this, do that, maybe, because it will come out as a little less rude, then your teammates will appreciate it. However, remember that it is okay to like tell your teammates things like, let's do this now, because you guys are a team, and they're not just gonna instantly say, oh, he's giving a call, and how dare he try to tell me what to do, or so, it is okay to be assertive, but, don't be like going aggressive on people. Hopefully that makes sense. I mean, part of that just comes down to practice. And so, we'll talk about that in a second, but, it's also important when you're making these calls to, if you're not sure, or even maybe if you are sure, you can ask questions in the form of like kind of trying to make a main call. So for example, if you ask like, can we slow push second here? That's basically you making a main call where you're saying, okay, let's like slow push second. We're like trying to milk push through second, where we're not trying to use Uber, but you're also making sure that your teammates are ready, so that they'll like respond to you and they'll also feel, more included in the overall team's goal. It's not just you saying, do this, go here, You're kind of asking to make sure everybody's on the same page. And if somebody's not on the same page, then they can say, like your demo needs ammo. He says, wait, I need ammo, hold on. And then that you're not going to be isolated with your demo, and your team is going to they're not going to feel as if they're always like not with you. Hopefully that makes sense. Besides that, it is important to remember, though, even though you are a team leader, it's inevitable that you and your teammates are going to be making mistakes. So don't really don't yell at them or don't get mad at them. If there's like a major mistake that you really need to fix, like for example, when you say, like, if you tell your med like bait choke and your med just walks through choke anyways, and then your med got forced or whatever because they were walking through choke, you don't want to scream at them. Generally you want to find a less chaotic time if you can to give them that information. So that could be like the start of a new round, when you're building Uber, when you wipe, or in like a stalemate, for example, or obviously when you're not playing. So all those times are good times to give them the information. But when it's still in the game, but you still need to give out that crucial piece of information, it's better to tell that teammate, saying like, can you do this next time? So for example, in that situation, you would say, uh, Med, can you try to delay walking through choke until I tell you it's safe next time? So making sure to like ask it in the form of a question, so that it's kind of like them being okay with complying with it, but it's also the best thing to do. So it might be a little bit manipulative, but like a little bit too manipulative, but hopefully it makes sense. And generally you don't want to try to fix like 1,000 mistakes at once. You don't want to when you all wipe, just say, just start bombarding your team with information. They're not going to be able to keep track of fixing like 1,000 mistakes at once. Just try to focus on one or maybe two really important things that they need to work on at that moment, and then let them work on that. Just remember that the game is still going on, so you should just, once you ask them to fix the one mistake, just take a deep breath and figure out, okay, the situation's changed, what should I say next, right? In terms of sometimes your comms can be a bit cluttered, or just too many people talking at once, or some people not feeling like they're able to have like a space to talk. It's important to if everybody's talking at the same time, you as a team leader, feel free to say like, might seem corny, but just to say like, okay, clear comms, like we're still going, we're still live, or something like that, or saying like, okay, focus on mid here, or you can ask a question, or like to kind of get everybody back on track, rather than keeping them all distracted, or them all talking about their own different like small issues or whatever. You can ask a question like, what are Ubers here? And that can kind of refocus everybody back onto the game, right? Besides that, I guess I'll ask quickly, does anybody have any questions about that before we just go on to the last part? Okay. I guess the last part I was going to say is, once you make a call, uh, feel don't like be the one be the don't really, you don't want to be the only one like talking ever, right? Not only is it important like when you make a call, or to listen for your teammates comms, but you also want to well, I guess this is a comm too, but give all your players a chance to, besides like not only calm, but like tell them what you're gonna do, like they're gonna do, or like if there needs to be a more specific call that needs to be made. For example, if you're losing one player for a force, maybe your roamer is the most vocal person, and they'll say like, okay, once you say like, okay, we'll lose one player for a force, your roamer would say, I'll die for the force here, or pocket die for the force here, or flank scout die for the force or something like that, so that you're less microing and let the people who are on the flank who know like more of the situation and where they're positioned, where they'll have a better idea of where their flank is positioned rather than the combo knowing exactly where the flank is positioned. So you don't have to be the only one to make the call. Once you don't have to be the only one to say like any type of calling thing, like for example, besides like the roamer maybe deciding who dies on a force, maybe your roamer or your pocket want to call a specific sack play they want to work on, or like they want to do right now. Even if you call, okay, let's sack someone here, your roamer or your pocket or somebody can make a call saying, okay, I want to try to pick this guy maybe in upper IT by jumping him and then having my flank pressure him or something like that. You feel free to give your teammates space, but also if you have a specific thing you need to have happen, in like a more chaotic time, it's important to then take the reins if it's really important that you say it. I mean, I guess generally, in terms of like, you don't want your flank players ever calling, obviously, for the rest of your team. So the only thing you would have is like maybe one of your flank players or whatever, or one of your 3 players who can sack. So for example, your 2 soldiers or your flank scout, one of them, whoever's the most vocal, having decided ahead of time, like not while you're in scrim or match, having one of those players who generally decides who sacks for like a force or whatever, who dies for it, if like your main caller calls one person dies for the force, or like when your team should take a like a whatever, when your flank is going to do some sort of pressuring or whatever. It's not a bad idea to have someone designated to do that, but obviously you don't want to call for the rest of the team. So, but yeah, it's not a bad idea. It's also not a bad idea to have someone be kind of in the combo beside your like your whoever your main caller is, be kind of like a backup main caller who, like, if your main caller doesn't really know what to do, or your main caller is distracted or anything like that, they can try to refocus and ask, what should we do here? You as a main caller can ask that specifically, to your backup caller, or just the rest of your team, saying like, what should we do here if you're just not sure, things happen like that, and your backup caller can give you a suggestion, or if you're ever distracted or you're too focused, maybe your backup caller can give that call for your main caller while your main caller is I don't know, focusing on a super intense 1v1 or something like that. But yeah, it's definitely not a bad idea, but just make sure that you all want to listen overall to the same, you all want to be following the same plan. And so if you don't want to have someone who is a backup caller or whatever, or like someone who's calling something for the flank, you don't want to call something that goes against the overall plan that the team is going for. So hopefully that makes sense. You can also feel free to, or some important things you can do are also just, repeating what you're going to do once you've already said it. Or like if your team is asking, like if you ask like, what are we doing here? And then somebody suggests something, it's not a bad idea to just repeat that if it's like a combo thing. So for example, if your backup caller, calls, like suggests like, we could do this here, and then you might say, okay, yeah, let's do this. That's not a bad idea, because then your team is all, you're agreeing with your backup caller and everybody knows, okay, we're doing this, rather than just your backup caller suggesting something and then nobody knowing what's going on, and then suddenly, some people doing things that your backup, like as part of the backup caller's plan, right? Besides that, the last thing I guess I'll mention is that it's important to get, feedback from your team members, and maybe even, as long as your team members are okay with it, you can like record the voice comms so you can, hear what your calls are and hear what information you got from your teammates, so you can kind of reevaluate it later when you're doing like a demo review or whatever. You can also ask like mentors or coaches and stuff like that for advice, on what you should do in a specific situation. So, or just, getting backup from your teammates on if you're calling too much, if you're not giving them enough information is good, especially when you're like halftime or something, like saying, am I talking too much? Am I like, do you guys understand my calls? Do you guys feel like you have a space in the comms to actually, like you have a space in the voice comms to actually make your comms like calm to your team what's going, like the information you need to tell. That's all important stuff to do. So feel free to ask your teammates for, what they think so that they can, you can just improve it and make it so that your team just does better with your calls, right? I guess that's basically everything I have. Does anybody have any like last questions?
This is kind of like a general thing, but I feel like as a main caller, I really struggle with like finding or like knowing what to do, or like knowing what's going wrong with a push or like what went wrong. So even like I don't know, a lot of times just like even if we just like wipe on a push, I just like don't really know what went wrong. Is there anything you say to like try to improve that and fix the mistakes that we made?
Yeah, so it's definitely tough because you don't want to like ask every single person what happened, but and you want to make sure, but you do want to figure out what happened. So,
I think that's something that's more easily figured out during a demo review as opposed to in game when you really
it
need
is,
to move on.
yeah, it is definitely easier to figure out in a demo review rather than a game. But I mean, even in game, there are things you can do. So if you ask your teammates, like, or ask a specific, if you think a specific player had something happen, you could ask, like, I mean, is if you're like the less you like know about or less sure you are of what happened there, the harder it is to be specific about what you wanted to know to see where the mistake was. So if you're not 100% sure what happened there, the only thing I can really say is asking your teammates in game and then, making sure that you don't let that conversation drag on too long. If, probably don't even let that go on more than 10 seconds at most, even if you like wipe or anything like that. You want to, once it's been that like 10 seconds or whatever, you have to, refocus your team by, going back and making one of those calls like, you know, saying, okay, clear comms, okay, let's focus on holding last, or where are we setting up or something like that, to just get everybody back from thinking about what just happened then so that they're distracted and getting everybody to focus on what they should be doing now, right? And then during mid and halftime, that's when you, or during a demo review, that's where you talk about it more.
Okay.
Every
And
team is
then
different though, like how much they like to talk about the game in the game, right?
yeah.
Some people don't like talking about it at all. Some teams like to talk about at least a little bit so they can adjust, but it's up to the environment of the team, to be honest.
Okay, so yeah, so while people say that, in reality, like, there's a middle ground that every single team like there's really like there's an acceptable range. Like if your team is not willing to talk about anything at all, like that's just like unacceptable. You need to be able to fix an issue that happens, but you know that doesn't necessarily mean you might be you know trying to fix too many issues. You might be too aggressive, but if there's a specific issue that you're trying to fix and nobody's even willing to hear the idea when you're like wiped or a round's over, that's just absolutely unacceptable. And I don't know, then you might have to, I don't know what you would do in that situation. You might just have to have like a more serious team with your talk afterwards, saying like we need to be able to actually, if there's a significant gaming issue, just focus on one issue to fix if we see it. But obviously you don't want to drone on forever. So I mean, it's hard to tell. It's hard. It's just hard to tell in reality. I mean, though, to be honest, it's reasonable to expect to be able to at least try to a little bit, like especially in between rounds. Like you should be That's when you can definitely have at least a few seconds to talk about it really quickly, but focusing on only really talking about it generally when it's in between rounds, when you're building Uber. What are the other situations? When